My name is Pablo de Jesus. I'm the executive director of the Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice, headquartered in Washington, D.C. We're pleased to have you this evening. I'm rather excited to have our speaker this evening. I caught Brett's thesis, let's call it, in a different forum, and I thought it was absolutely um, amazing and interesting. And I asked him to share that information with you, with all of us. So let's just do him the courtesy of putting into the chat our names, maybe our states, just to give him a sense of who's in the room with him. And I'm going to ask us to just take a moment of quiet contemplation, leave your baggage of the day elsewhere. Try to center and focus and be mindful and present and with us in community and relationship here. Take some deep breaths in. Deep breaths out. Know that you are in community and we appreciate you. And tonight's topic is, thoughtful and heavy. So we're going to ask you to be thoughtful, tender with each other as we cover this topic. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening. Brett Heinz serves as American Friends Service Committee's Global Policy Coordinator for Economic and Climate Justice, where he works to promote policy solutions that provide economic justice and climate sustainability and a lasting peace around the world. I'm going to drop into the chat a link where you can find Brett's work, but please know that I encountered Brett in my work doing interfaith and multi-religious work. And we at UUSJ deeply cherish American Friends Service Committee for all the wonderful programs and expertise that they bring to bear on so many issues. And we're deeply pleased to have Brett give us some of his time and his attention this evening. So with that, I'm going to give it away to Brett. Brett, go for it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Pablo, for having me tonight. It's really great to be able to talk with everyone. My name is Brett Heinz. I'm with the American Friends Service Committee. We're a Quaker organization working for a more just world. And a little bit about me and how I got interested in the idea of militarism within the United States is that I'm originally from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is currently being occupied by Border Patrol, and I now live in Washington, D.C., which is being occupied by the National Guard. So I'm going to be taking a trip between two different state military occupied cities for this Thanksgiving next week. Naturally, I've been thinking a lot about this issue and doing some reading, trying to figure out where exactly all of this came from. And from those thoughts came a presentation that I was able to share earlier, and which I'll now be sharing with all of you. Bear with me here as I get the PowerPoint part set up. I think that should be showing. Let's see here. Okay. So I have been looking into the history of the war on drugs and the war on terror and what it has to do with where we are right now. I first gave this presentation last month, but I did a little bit of updating today, so some of the numbers are more recent now. And as you see, I will apologize right off the bat. I am one of those people who just writes everything that I'm going to say onto the PowerPoint as I'm presenting, but hopefully that will make it easy to read along as you'd like. Right now, we're in a moment where, alongside a number of other different forms of cracking down on dissent, the Trump administration is also expanding the roles that military, security, and intelligence agencies play within the United States' own borders. Four U.S. cities have been occupied by the National Guard this year: LA, Memphis, Portland, and DC, and others, though they haven't had a National Guard presence, like Charlotte, have been occupied in some form or another by incoming federal organizations who are bringing significant manpower to carry out operations without announcement in different cities. The National Guard specifically has their powers limited under what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that military cannot serve law enforcement roles on U.S. soil. But they can overcome this by cooperating with federal law enforcement. So here in DC, they sent not only the National Guard, but they've also sent out deployments of ICE, of DHS, of FBI, DEA, all those alphabet soup agencies who do have arrest powers. And they can work together with the police who have their hands freed by National Guard taking over a lot of their normal patrol functions. So not only are we having these deployments, but the fact that we are now having such incredible expansions in a lot of security agencies like ICE is giving the President of the United States the ability to pick and choose and kind of design his own campaigns within U.S. borders. Another front of this has been on the US-Mexican border, where Trump, in a decision made pretty early in his new administration, has started setting up national defense areas, which is a territory around it's a territory around the US-Mexican border in which the military is allowed to detain suspects and to question them, sort of half suspending the regular rule of law in these areas in the names of immigration employment. All of this said, I'm pulling on a lot of threads here. What brings it all together is that within the US right now, we have 35,000 US troops currently deployed within our own borders in what is a pretty unprecedented, probably never happened before type of situation. The Institute for Policy Studies recently did some back of the envelope math to try to figure out how much this would cost. And through November, it's probably cost about $500 million right now, just military deployments within the United States. The White House has even, in extreme scenarios, toyed around with the idea of using the Insurrection Act to effectively declare martial law, which would get around the Posse Comitatus Act and allow him to send in National Guard deployments that would have the ability to act as police officers. We don't know quite how seriously they're taking this idea, but it is definitely a concept that they are discussing. All of that's happening here at home, and that's already a lot. What I quickly realized was how connected this was to the situation outside of our borders as well, more specifically, the situation in the Caribbean and the Pacific right now, where under the name of Operation Southern Spear, the United States government is in what it's now calling a state of active hostilities. They do not have proper legal authorization to declare this, but they have decided they're going to anyway, which is a presidential tradition at this point, I guess. But he's been going a lot further than usual, particularly because earlier this year he designated a lot of drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations for the first time. And this dramatically expanded our definition of what terrorism is and who all is included within it. And at the same time, he's claimed that he has the ability to essentially, without Congress, declare war against any foreign terrorist organization at any time. And the result of that has been a number of different operations in the Caribbean, 21 airstrikes so far on small civilian boats, killing at least 83 people, the deployment of 15,000 US troops to the Caribbean, and the authorization of CIA activity within Venezuela. All of this has been justified under the cover of the idea of narco-terrorism, which is a controversial, very political concept that came out of the Reagan administration. And it's important to note here that Venezuela plays a very, very small role in the regional drug trade. Not no role, but they do play a role in regional cocaine trade, but zero role at all in regional fentanyl trade, which is what the Trump administration has been accusing them of for some time. These U.S. airstrikes have prompted a lot of different reactions. They've raised alarm at a UN Security Council meeting, and they are generally considered to have led to the recent resignation of a major admiral in charge of the area within the United States military. The Senate's voted twice now in an attempt to try to stop the president from doing all of this. The most recent one failed very narrowly, 49-51, in an incredibly close vote, which was closer than the first one, and other attempts are being planned. So this is a matter which is working its way through Congress as we speak, in some sense or another. But now I've thrown, twice as much stuff at you. There's all of this stuff happening within the United States borders, and there's all this stuff happening outside, and it all seems to be happening so quickly and escalating so fast. It made me want to go back and ask, well, how did we get here? And what were the precedents? Because this is not strictly an aberration. This isn't a break from usual. This is a continuation. This is a carrying on of policies which have been going on for a very long time now, on which particularly I draw comparisons to in the war on drugs and the war on terror. Oh, I got a little bit ahead of myself here. I was starting on this. Two quotes that sort of carry in on what I'm talking about here for why we should be considering the foreign and the domestic as two different sides of the same coin. President Trump in late September stated that National Guard deployments to U.S. cities are, quote, a war too. It's a war from within. We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military. And about a week later, Attorney General Bondi made the statement that just like we did with the cartels, that is, bombing them extrajudicially, we're going to take the same approach with Antifa, destroying the entire organization from top to bottom. And as I'm sure many of you know, Antifa is kind of a catch-all phrase at this point for left-wing activism in the Trump administration. So they themselves are making statements which say that the very bloody approach that they're taking in the Caribbean should be understood as part of one larger campaign with what's been going on here within the United States. And it made me think of what's called the imperial boomerang. It's a concept which suggests that violence that's committed overseas by an imperial power will eventually make its way back into the imperial society itself and then be used against the domestic population. We've seen a long waves of this in the history of U.S. wars where technology and strategies that are developed on the battlefield are brought back and used by American police or by intelligence and security services. Another common feature between these domestic and these international actions is the dramatic expansion of presidential power, something that started with President Nixon and what's called the imperial presidency, but has been speeding up for quite a long time now through Bush, through Obama, through Trump until this year, where it has grown faster than it has ever before, it probably at any point in United States history, except for perhaps World War II, World War I. And we are not at war, which is really, I think, what makes all of this quite as absurd as it is, but I'm not sure how long that will be the case. As the lines between these different parts of the security state blur, as the National Guard gets deployed both at home and then we are also playing police in the Caribbean, the restraints upon how the president can use these security services have been falling apart at the same time, which is a recipe, in my opinion, for a very severe degree of authoritarianism and a very dictatorial government. I end in bold this slide with a quote here that I actually had not run across until I started researching all of this, which was President Trump in late August saying, quote, I have the power to do anything I want to do. I'm the president of the United States. And I think we should understand this, although it is obviously constitutionally untrue, we should understand this as his actual understanding of the situation. And until someone proves otherwise, he is largely correct. No one has so far stopped him in doing what he is doing. So now I get back into the history of it, and as with many problems, this is one that starts with Nixon, I make the argument. Because while a lot of what Trump is doing right now is unprecedented in how far he's going, the types of things he's doing have a lot of precedence. So I started by taking a look at the Nixon administration's expansion of the executive power to launch the war on drugs. And I came across a lot of similarities with our present situation. The war on drugs allowed the National Guard to play a much stronger role in policing within the United States. They participated in tens of thousands of arrests in the early 1990s. It weakened the Posse Comitatus Act by giving the military a little bit more leeway in how it deals with law enforcement roles and some of its engagements. It increased the size of security state agencies, and it involved aggressive meddling in Latin America, which often came at the expense of human life. And it had some of the same motivations as well, I think, which is a racist fear of others, but also a desire to repress domestic political opponents. While right now we think of the Trump administration as going beyond anything we've heard of before in terms of stepping down on civil society and repressing critics in the US, the war on drugs had very much the same intention. I always go back to this quote from John Ehrlichman, who was President Nixon's domestic affairs advisor, and he said, quote, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." And I think that that sort of racial scapegoating is also at play here in the attempt to try to draw drugs and immigration together and make it seem like these two things are conflatable or that you should be afraid of them for the same reason. The war on drugs continued and expanded under President Reagan, who issued a national security directive saying that drug trafficking was a serious threat to the national security of the United States. And while this sounds like regular rhetoric today, it was really a pretty incredible expansion of military involvement in law enforcement powers for the time. Under both Reagan and Bush, as I mentioned earlier, National Guard deployments became fairly common, working together with state and local law enforcement to assist in arrests. And at times, they even made the argument that it was explicitly an ideological tool, a tool of propaganda to send the National Guard in somewhere. One officer I quote here from the Guard says, "Military force must be used to change the attitudes and activities of Americans who are dealing and using drugs." Again, military force must be used to change the attitudes of Americans. The National Guard is America's legally feasible attitude change agent. That was 30 years ago. That was not this year. So we could start seeing how some of these through lines of authoritarianism show up in earlier episodes of American history, including with the term narco-terrorism, which I'm currently looking into and working on an article about right now, just that idea, because it has a really weird origin. And I won't treat this as too much of a tangent, but it's worth focusing on because the Trump administration says that what they're doing in the Caribbean is justified by the fact that the people on the boats and the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, are narco-terrorists. They've labeled both of them as such. That term is not a real analytical term. It's not a description of the real world. It's a political slogan. It came out of the Reagan administration, and particularly with a member of the New Right, Louis Tams, who was U.S. ambassador to Colombia, and who used it to describe a number of leftist guerrilla groups operating in Colombia at that time. It was criticized pretty quickly, even within the 1980s, for being a massive oversimplification and really kind of mischaracterizing what was happening. But it worked very well as a justification for what the administration wanted to do anyway, which was to increase its involvement militarily in Latin America. So it became kind of a staple of the way that we talk about drug trafficking. The irony here is that Tams himself, who helped create this term, was involved in the Iran-Contra scandal by helping the Contras, a violent anti-communist group in Nicaragua, traffic guns and drugs while he was the ambassador of Panama, meaning that by the definition he set forth, the person who came up with the idea of narco-terrorism is a narco-terrorist. And kind of goes to show how loaded and politicized of a term that this is when it gets used so matter-of-factly. But you really start to see how even back into the 1970s and 1980s, a lot of the seeds of where we are now have started to be spread throughout the field. Sorry for that. The war on terror kind of changed everything and did not change much both at the same time. It was a rejuvenation for a campaign of militarism in the war on drugs that had kind of started to fade after the end of the Cold War. The security state was looking for modus operandi, for reason for moving forward now that the communists had been defeated, and the War on Terror helped to fill in that role. There were a lot of parts of the War on Terror that helped bring us to where we are today. The expansion of the military, a lot of new military interventions, restrictions on civil liberties through the Patriot Act, and a number of other bills, as well as the creation of what we now know as the Department of Homeland Security, which framed immigration in such a way that it was a security issue. Whereas previously it had been seen as a civilian matter, a matter of Secretary of State or of Treasury. Now it is a matter purely for the security state. The logic of the war on drugs also very quickly merged into the logic of the war on terror. And you could start to see places where they popped up together and had fused inside the Bush administration's mind as early as 2003 or so. At one point, I don't have it on here, but I think Bush made a statement that said, when you're using drugs, you're supporting terrorists. When you stop using drugs, you are helping the war on terror, or something of that sort. So the attempts to try to draw these ideas together through narco-terrorism and through a bunch of other different ideas came about really pretty quickly, and it influenced our policy approaches in a lot of different countries. So Venezuela, for example, in 2002, the year after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. backed a short-lived coup government in Venezuela, um, which had deposed Hugo Chavez, who's a known critic of U.S. foreign policy. And after Hugo Chavez returned to power, U.S. policymakers often made, throughout the rest of the decade really, accusations that Hugo Chavez was connected to any and every Middle Eastern terrorist organization that you can imagine. There were attempts to say that Hugo Chavez is friends with Al Qaeda, with the Taliban, with Hezbollah, and with Hamas all at the same time. And as you might imagine, there was pretty weak evidence for any of this, if there was any evidence at all. But it helped them to draw together a list of enemies and a list of grievances into one larger theory of the United States being under threat from abroad, and we needing the United States needing a strong military response to address these threats. Similarly to a lot of these fake claims that had been made about Hugo Chavez, we are now witnessing a lot of very fake claims being made about the Venezuelan government, which, to be clear, the Venezuelan government does have a history of corruption, of severe corruption and human rights abuses. But nonetheless, the specific accusations being made against them by the Trump administration are false. The idea first being that the current leader of Venezuela is the head of a cartel which is supposedly called the Cartel of the Suns. This organization, which is soon to be designated a terrorist organization, does not exist as a terrorist organization. It was a term that was used to describe kind of the system of corruption within Venezuela. But the Trump administration is now arguing that it is a real cartel and that the Venezuelan president is really at the lead of this real cartel. It's sort of just a series of fictional justifications to arrive at a particular end. But this is kind of where Venezuela, for our purposes, enters the story here in 2002. Totally on the other side of the world, we were also in Afghanistan, which is a country that witnessed an explosion in the growth of opium poppy after the fall of the Taliban. And the United States, during its occupation of Afghanistan, was obviously very busy elsewhere. They had their hands full at the time, and counter narcotics was never a priority of theirs. We were trying to set up a new government, and a lot of the people associated with that government themselves got their hands into the opium trade to the point that by I think it was 2008 or 2009, Afghanistan was producing more heroin than the rest of the world combined 9 times over. So 9 planet Earths worth of heroin was coming out of Afghanistan at one point under US occupation. This whole story makes up its own tangent, which is now a whole book called The Fort Bragg Cartel that you should check into. And it sort of documents how, similar to what happened in Vietnam, a lot of this heroin got brought over from Afghanistan by a small number of troops who were involved in drug smuggling into the US in a way that helped to presage and kind of helped inflame the opioid crisis. So you start to see pretty quickly how all of these different threads of the war on terror and the war on drugs run into each other, and how they can kind of only be worsened by an increase in military power and military responses. Finally, before moving on, is the notion of targeted killing, which is a strategy essentially saying we're going to find a few very important people who are links in the chain of command for a terrorist organization or for a cartel, and we're going to take those people out in hopes that it disrupts the whole organization. We started this idea with drug cartels in the war on drugs, and then extended it over and expanded it in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was a major motivation strategy behind our approach to drone warfare in Iraq and in a number of other situations. We've now seen it come back from the war on terror to the war on drugs once more in these strikes, which we've been seeing in the Caribbean on 21 now boats that are, frankly, we don't know who's on them. The United States military is not verifying any of the specific identities of anyone who's aboard the boat. I think that they're looking for patterns of boats coming and going, and then just based on those patterns, taking shots and calling it intelligence. Because if they had stronger evidence by now, they would have provided it. And they really do not seem to be discriminating much, meaning that what began as so-called targeted killing of kingpins is now at this point a very untargeted killing of anyone who's in a particular area of the ocean at a given point in time. All of that's grim. This is not a happy presentation, but I think that it does provide a lot of background for the situation that we find ourselves in now, and kind of helps us realize where all of this has been coming from and how we got here. I think, and this is kind of one big part of my thesis here, President Trump believes that he could break the rules and do whatever he wants because under the war on drugs and the war on terror, previous presidents did break the rules and do whatever they wanted, and there was no real accountability or no additional checks put into place to prevent it. So every element, every negative thing, not every, but so many of these large negative aspects of the war on drugs and war on terror are now replicated in our current moment. The line between cop and soldier is getting blurrier. Hysteria is being made up, just pulled out of thin air without fact to justify the repression of political opponents. We're seeing a lot of racist discourse about crime and foreign threats, about threats from the outside coming to attack us from within. The expansion of the security state, new personnel, new equipment, new weaponry, new armor, new vehicles, all to protect us from this political concept of narco-terrorism. The treatment of domestic drug abuse as an international military problem, which is largely the function of narco-terrorism as an idea, to make us think that the only way we can address drug abuse is by going after foreign suppliers, rather than focusing on drug addiction here at home. Bloody and illegal interventions in Latin America, unfortunately, a through line throughout most of modern American history. The rapid deployment of National Guard throughout the country, both as a tool of policing, but also as a tool of propaganda. And finally, either ignorance or simply not caring on the part of our Congress and our policymakers about the history of how past policies have led us to where we are right now, and subsequently resulting in them doubling down on a failed status quo by suggesting more response, more military response, and sort of just ratcheting us up further to a point where the state only grows stronger even as the threats against us are largely fabricated. All of this, I think, has very big implications for how we should be thinking about our current situation and for how we should be talking about our situation when we're discussing it with others. Just a moment. I think that a lot of the pushback against the Trump administration has been based in what he's legally allowed to do, what the precedent is, what the constitutional restraints are. When in practice, I think we should be challenging what's happening now on a deeper level than that, even if this was constitutional, which it's not, even if this was legal, which it's not. The fact remains that should stop looking at civilian issues through a security lens. We need to stop thinking through about everything as something that can be solved with more guns and more bullets and more cops and more soldiers. How should that affect the way that we think about the Trump administration? I think that there's a lot of different ways. First, I think that While it's obviously true that the military occupations of US cities are not really related to crime rates, are not really motivated by crime rates, we should be acknowledging that they are explicitly about intimidation and control. They are about trying to change how people think of the situation that they are in and trying to restrain protesters or activists from resisting the current administration. Not only are U.S. airstrikes in the Caribbean unrelated to drug trafficking or the actual solution to drug addiction, but they are part of a regime change operation based on transparent lies. The reason that this has all focused so significantly on the one government that we have been trying to overthrow for over 20 years now is not merely a coincidence. It's an extension of prior U.S. policy, which began under previous administrations. I think we need to reject entirely the idea that drug abuse is a problem that has military solutions. It has never had military solutions. So long as drug addiction exists as a major problem in our society, the drugs are going to find a way in. The question is, how do we reduce drug addiction in our society? How do we help people get out of cycles of drug abuse in a humane way that actually addresses the root of the issue? I think that's especially important right now because the Trump administration has been cutting a lot of the substance abuse programs and discouraging a lot of the harm prevention measures, which actually would solve these issues that he claims to be solving by bombing random boats in the Caribbean. I'll just go down these for a bit longer here because I don't want to drag on too long. I could take all night. But I think our underline here should be that expanding the security state often creates more problems than it solves. We're constantly trying to respond to a new threat, and in the process, a series of unintended consequences brings us to new threats that we now have to have more security for. And throughout this whole time, we're kind of just ignoring the human causes of all of these issues. Um, Based on all of this, and also the present reality of our current situation, I think that we should be demanding that DHS not be reformed, but that it be dismantled entirely. I think that ICE should be abolished outright. FEMA should be made an independent agency. Various agencies turn to places where they would be more useful, but the Department of Homeland Security, as it exists, is a department of authoritarianism. It's a department of control and coercion over people's lives. We should also start thinking pretty seriously now about the issue of the imperial presidency, which has been largely ignored as a political issue for the last several presidencies, even as it's grown slowly but steadily. I think we're now reaching a point where it's becoming clear the president should not be able to do anything at any time for any reason. And we really do need stronger guardrails in place to prevent that. We finally, penultimately, I guess, should be really turning away from this nationalist motion in which we find a problem of our own and we point towards someone else for causing it. We refuse to take a lot of our issues as our issues, and we would like to think that if some scary person outside of our borders could be done away with, then none of this would be happening. And that's an issue which, when you think about it, really does affect a lot of US foreign policy, a lot of trade policy, a lot of immigration policy, not just this particular set of circumstances that we find ourselves in. Our problems are the forces of greed and hatred and corruption in our own country, and they are plenty. Our problem does not lie in foreign boogeymen. Finally, and then I will stop sharing all of this very heavy lecturing on this topic. But I think we really do have to hone in and come to an acceptance that we cannot security our way out of everything. If we are trapped in thinking about all of our problems with this one lens, where airstrikes and drone strikes and surveillance and restrictions and new guns for police officers is the only way that we could solve any problem, then we're never going to solve a problem again. As we see the military expanding into every facet of our lives, we should be asking for this not only to end, but for a reversal of it as well, and for a return to more humane and more loving practices of solidarity between one another as members of the United States. So, all of that said, I'm not sure how I am on time, but that is the end of my presentation. I hope that you found some of that useful, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have them.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Brett, you're absolutely on time. Um, I'm going to encourage folks, if they have questions, to do what Pat Butler is doing, which is to raise your electronic hand. That's usually a part of the reaction toggles that are at the bottom of your Zoom dialog box. If you're on your phone, you might be able to find them by toggling around and raising your hand. If you choose to raise your flesh and blood hand, I will do my best to see you, but Zoom doesn't always allow me to, it doesn't put you to the head of the queue and draw my attention to you. So I encourage you to please use your electronic hand if at all possible. Um, Before we get started, I will take the privilege of being host and asking the first question, which is Brett, you've laid out an interesting thesis about how certain policies are moving together and why things get tied together. Um, what could we do differently, like substantively differently moving forward in order to take on this complex if we agree with you? Because in some ways we've been working on these on disentangling the war on terror and the war on politics on drugs for at least the past 15 years, if not longer. So what what can change moving forward? And then we'll go to Pat.
That is the million-dollar question. And I wish I had a perfect a strategy, a guideline, set of steps to move forward. That's a question I've been wrestling with a lot, frankly. I think that, and perhaps it almost sounds naive to say this, but it would require a broadening of the scope that we talk about these issues in. I think that after 2 decades now of the forever war of the war on terror and even longer of the war on drugs, we've kind of started to nibble around the edges and we've looked for pieces of it that are weak and that can be addressed one-on-one. So, we'll do an individual war powers resolution here. We'll do an individual reform to ICE or DEA here. And we focus on these because they are movable, because they're pieces that we can be moving. But I think in the process of all of that, we've kind of lost the larger picture, or we've stopped thinking about ways to address the larger picture. So I would argue for something a lot more foundational. For example, an entire new piece of legislation around the war powers of the president, which said that the president could not engage in any foreign conflict at all without an explicit vote by Congress and immediate impeachment as a penalty. Now, would that be easy to pass through Congress? No, absolutely, it would not. I think what I'm trying to call for overall here strategically is to go further back than we have been so far in how we're thinking about these issues and trying to hit at the root of it more to address the foundation of how we've gotten here.
Thank you, Brett. As Unitarian Universalists, we love looking at root causes and root harms. That's where we like to try and direct our energy, or to the extent that we're going to be disruptors and make an intervention for justice, we try to go as close to the root of the matter as possible. So that's one of the reasons I brought you to speak to UUSJ today. And with that, I'm going to invite Pat to come off of mute and ask their question.
I was very heartened to hear you talk about, however briefly, the drug addiction problem here at home presenting such a lucrative market. Why wouldn't people try to? And that 500 million that they would believe has been spent so far would go a long way to setting up treatment centers here in this country and hiring professional people, not imprisoning them, but helping them to reduce the market and there's not just one country that's satisfying the drug problem, the drug addiction here. It would solve it for all those countries. And it would help the people and the families that are addicted.
Yeah, I think that's another important piece of this that hasn't really been brought into the conversation as much as it should be, because this is supposedly an issue about the problem of narcotics. Trump is justifying this with this whole narco-terrorism idea and with the idea that bringing cocaine or fentanyl or anything of this sort into the country is a form of terrorism. But I think, and maybe this goes back to Reagan, the supply side Reaganomics. We always think of these things in terms of the supply of who's bringing the drugs in, when the reality is that we are the largest buyers of cocaine on the entire world. The reason that there's drug trafficking is because we as the American people are buying it. And I think that that draws us to look inward and to say, how do we deal with problems of addiction in our own neighborhoods and in our own communities? And how can we use these resources that are being wasted on sending National Guard to go stand in front of my train station to instead start improving human lives and addressing, the root causes of these issues? So I think that that's a big part of it as well. We need to be talking about the money wasted on militarism and how much more effectively it could be used in helping people directly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pat, for your question. And for sure, I mean, as Unitarian Universalists and certainly UUSJ, we've been involved with the Poor People's Campaign, and I've always loved their explicit plan. I mean their demand, they have a demand to dismantle militarism, right? Because they've recognized that that is a policy problem in and of itself. So anyway, does anybody else have any questions? I encourage us to be brave. Raise your electronic hand or your flash. Oh, Karen, go for it.
Well, I'm just wondering if you see anybody in Congress who has hinted at this kind of legislative perspective.
You mean in terms of the idea I had earlier for war powers?
Yeah.
Not really, honestly. I've heard some people kind of like hinting at the idea. I guess I have heard that. I think it was Ro Khanna, maybe, who's active on a lot of these war issues. No piece of legislation, to my knowledge, has been introduced quite like that. And I think it would be quite an uphill battle to get something like that through Congress. But I do think though that's the scale we need to be thinking in terms of particularly because we just keep coming back to these same sets of junctures where the president is just kind of handing himself the authority to do anything that he'd like. So I don't know. Hopefully, we'll see something soon. And I think if this continues, there's a chance we will.
Thank you so much. Judy, then Kat, and then a question from the chat.
Why is it that the UN is not raising concerns about the bombings of the boats, the supposedly Venezuelan boats?
It's a good question. The UN response to this has been strange. So they do have rapporteurs at the UN whose job it is to monitor human rights situations. And a few of those human rights rapporteurs have come out and made statements on the UN's behalf, criticizing the airstrikes. But as an institution, as a body, the UN has been pretty hesitant to approach this so far. There was a Security Council meeting that was called by Venezuela. Um, and it was interesting to see a lot of countries come out and criticize the United States attacks, but also so many countries to just sort of take a step back and say, look, this isn't us. This isn't happening to us. We're hands off here. We don't want. I think part of it is the intimidation of the Trump administration. The fact that the Trump administration has just been threatening so many countries for so little reason all over the world. Who would really want to step forward and say, how dare you? The one country that really has stepped up to say, how could you possibly do this is Gustavo Petro in Colombia, who's been very vocal in criticizing the Trump administration. And as a response, we're now sanctioning him. We're sanctioning him financially, and I think that we're taking penalties against the nation of Colombia for making a basic moral call about the activities going on. So I think it's intimidation. I guess if I had to put it to the simplest terms, the United States just has the power, and Donald Trump has the willingness to abuse that power, that it's very scary for a lot of countries to just come out right now and make a big stink out of this.
Thank you, Brett. Kat?
Thank you. I've tried for so long to work from the other end of it, to build up appetite for helping drug addicts and people who have addictions in general. Um, and I realize there's some powerful forces within the United States that want to increase drug addiction rather than reduce it. Um, but does anybody has anyone had any success in getting other people to join them in interrupting the addictions at their roots? And a lot of times this goes down to early intervention in mental health issues. And I don't even like the term mental health because so much of the time that involves trauma, and the PTSD response is actually an attempt to get healthy. But the fear, then the escaping from that overwhelming anxiety that people are being forced to live in, I think actually produces the desire to escape into drugs. So everything that we are doing as a country right now to everyone who belongs to an oppressed group seems to me to be aimed at intensifying their fears. And of course, that is also going to increase the market for drugs as people look for a way to escape. Anybody have any thing they've done that has been successful?
It's a very astute observation. I think that's very true in that so much drug abuse is driven by despair, and the types of responses that we're creating to supposedly address this drug abuse only creates more despair. And it really goes to show just how pointless of an approach that this has been. In my experience, I think a lot of the groups that are working directly with people who are dealing with addiction, it tends to be a very local scene for organizations. I don't know if there's a national federation or something, but it tends to be, from what I've heard, that on a city by city basis, there tends to be groups of people who are doing a lot of outreach and a lot of harm reduction and things of that sort. On the national level, I know the Drug Policy Alliance is probably the biggest name working in this area, and they've had some success in state policy before. I know in Oregon a few years ago, but from the policy level, that's one of the larger names working on it. I think when it comes to reaching out to people on an individual level, though, it probably does make more sense to work locally. If anyone else had ideas to offer in response to that, though, I'd be interested in hearing them as well.
Mostly what I have to offer are issues, like you mentioned, Oregon.
Mhm.
Um, I have some clients in Oregon who are struggling with drug addiction and really want to be free of it. And again, they tend to be people who belong to oppressed groups. And the more they're oppressed, the more they tend to want to seek drugs. But if in many cases, those interventions are turned over to health resources, and they tend to be so unavailable. And I'm thinking even like Portland, Gresham, uh, areas that, are actually under attack by ICE or would be if they could be. Um, and I'm living in Florida where there's nothing at all except putting people in handcuffs and taking them to prison. Um, that idea of prison as treatment for drug addiction is so painful. And I have also seen people make those drug contacts in prison
Yeah,
that when they're finally released, um, increase and worsen their addictions. I mean, personally, as this is personal for me. My foster kid was one of those people. And
thank you so much, Kat. I want to make sure that Brett has the chance to answer as many questions as possible. And from the chat, Ursula's asking, why are there also now attacks in the Pacific? Do you have a sense of why, Brett?
oh,
Yeah, that is a good question, and not one that I have 100% figured out, but that I'm maybe 80% of the way there on. Clearly, those are not related to Venezuela in the way that a lot of Caribbean airstrikes are. I think that they are, so the patterns, what I said, My theory of how they're working is that they are probably through some combination of satellites and drone imagery and other forms of surveillance, looking for particular boat patterns coming north out of South America. And my guess is that they found some of the same patterns they were looking for in Venezuela, on the Pacific side of Colombia and Ecuador as well. And since they clearly do not have many restraints on their activities in the first place, they just said, yeah, let's just shoot all of them. Which is really kind of the, I guess, for show aspect of this. Because regime change isn't the only motivation here. They're also looking to make a show of, as I mentioned earlier, immigration and drugs being like tied in with one another. Crime is immigration, immigration is drugs, drugs is crime, and they just spin all of that together in a blender conceptually. So the more attention that they could bring, the more show that they can make of going after drug trafficking, I think in their minds strengthens their case and draws more attention to their theory of the story. And there is, to be clear, I think more drugs coming out of not particularly that side, because there are a lot of drugs coming out of the Caribbean side of Colombia, but there is drug trafficking that they may be catching. I'm sure that of the 21 boats that they've hit, some of them probably had drugs on them. My bet is that in most cases, there's not drugs on any of these. Some of them are surely fishermen. Some of them, in some cases, it might be migration, especially people fleeing Venezuela for islands in the Caribbean. I'm not entirely sure why they've made this point of expanding it into the Pacific, other than just to make a show of it. But that's kind of where I've been thinking of.
Thank you. Deb, do you have a question? I recognize you in the stack.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I liked how you brought the historical fact of the bringing DHS into existence after 9/11, and really how it has mushroomed in effect. I mean, from airport security to taking on so many different roles throughout our country. And now I think it has more money than most armies in other countries. And the idea of dismantling it, I think, is a great idea. I'm wondering how, how would we get enough traction to do that? Because I think we can show it really has far overstepped what it was originally intended to be. And again, as you say, it has really militarized immigration, which wasn't something that was done before. So how to get this Pandora thing back in the box is would be a great question.
It's a good analogy for it as well. We've opened this box and now we've just let this creature grow to this size now where it would be very difficult to take on. Nonetheless, I think it's something that we're probably going to have to do, and at a minimum, it's something that we should be keeping in the national conversation. I think that's how a lot of this starts because a lot of people don't even know. I'm sure if you surveyed, the average American about when DHS was created, they would not know that it's younger than their child. That is, like it's only got its driver's license a few years ago. It is a new thing that we made recently and that we can unmake and turn into a more constructive arrangement of our government agencies. It's going to be difficult because whenever one tries to go against narratives of security in politics, politicians always feel like they're risking something. Like what if you vote to get rid of DHS and then, there's a terrorist attack a month later, and then you're the guy who is getting attack ads against you because he voted against Homeland Security. Even voting against the term Homeland Security sounds bad. I think we're still in the stage where we need a lot of education about what this government agency is, what it does, and how easily it has been abused and just mushroomed into this uncontrollable beast that it is now. And once we really get that going, I think in the public conversation, we'll probably start to see more movement on it within Congress.
Yes, I would agree with that. I see you, Paula. Let me finish a comment and then I'll say something and then we'll hear your question. I would agree with you, and I would remind all of our folks in general, there are very few leaders among our members of Congress. They are great at reflecting back at us what they hear and perceive as the general norm among us as their constituents. The best metaphor for a member of Congress is, in fact, a mirror. So if you start telling them to be bold and to be brave and to challenge policy, and you get your friends to do it, and you organize your friends to help you do it, then slowly over time, they will begin to do that, because they will begin to believe that that's really what you want, that you're not making just a cathartic flash in the pan sort of request, right? And that you represent others who want to see them become more brave. Just as when they get a whole lot of hammering to be less inclusive and less bold and less sharing and welcoming, they go in that direction. So in some ways, the real answer to the question, the last 2 or 3 questions is, are we willing to engage members of Congress and raise over and over again with them a concern that we have an imperial president, that the Department of Homeland Security is metastasizing into something well beyond airport security, and trying to make sure that make sure that we have a good handle on who are all the bad actors who may be coming into or out of the country. I mean, remember, that's what it was about, right? It was about the fact that some of the people involved in 9/11 were taking flight classes in the United States, and that nobody was able to flag that, right? That they were able to register for commercial airport pilot school. So I think there's a space for this kind of conversation, but the real question is, do we have the commitment to see it through? Now, in the final 2-3 minutes, Paula, ask your last question of the evening.
This is more of a comment than a question. If we want to know how to dismantle something like DHS, watch what Trump is doing to the Department of Education. He has taken it into little pieces and thrown different pieces into different associations or organizations. And eventually we're not going to have a Department of Education. And of course, we're not in power, so we can't start dismantling DHS. But if you want to know how to do it, just watch him. He's dismantling lots of stuff.
I think there's some truth to that. Simply in that, under Trump 2.0, we're seeing a lot of things that we've never seen before. And in this moment, it is very scary and it is very destructive, seeing all of these things that he's taking apart. But that also means that the playbook is wide open now. The realm of possibility for what we can be demanding from Congress has also gotten larger, because the scope of what is up for debate is now larger. I think that I think is part of the reason why I'm trying to encourage people to take kind of a bigger, bolder look at a lot of these issues, because Trump right now is just taking a hammer to everything. He's just, turning a lot of traditional American institutions into dust. And when all of this is over, there's going to be a rebuilding process, a reconstruction process, as they called it after the Civil War. And during that reconstruction process, we should have ideas in mind for how we prevent something like this from happening again, because that space for demanding new things has now been opened up. So at the moment that this is a time of great fear, of great anxiety, of great trepidation, it's also in some sense an opening or a moment of opportunity. And I think that we should be taking advantage of that when communicating with our lawmakers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brett. I mean, I just want to highlight and underscore, underline 3 or 4 times what you just said. I mean, faith communities, one of our few superpowers in society over time, is helping other human beings to articulate the positive alternative vision to what they are experiencing in any given moment, season, or lifetime. And so that is what we need to do. That is the talent that we could be leveling against this particular difficulty. We could be challenging members of Congress and our own friends in our churches, congregations and fellowships to envision what it would look like to stop militarizing the war on drugs, to stop empowering an imperial president. And frankly, what we've been saying in the last 2-3 statements and questions is very true. As the current president erases so much of the structure from the whiteboard that everybody has historically said, you can't mess with that structure. It's there, like it's done. That is a sacred cow that shall not be touched. You cannot erase that. Well, he's erasing it. At some point where there's going to be an opportunity to put new things on the chalkboard or new things on the whiteboard. So we need to do the work in advance of that opportunity so that we're ready for the political and sociological moment. And thank you so much, Brett, for being with us this evening. We appreciate you. Let's all give some appreciation and thanks to Brett.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all for tuning in this night.
You're very welcome.